There are certain stories about Taylor Swift that make headlines because they are huge. A new album, a sold-out stadium, a surprise appearance, a relationship moment that sends the internet into a frenzy. But every once in a while, a story comes along that feels completely different. It isn't about the stage. It isn't about the cameras. It isn't even really about the superstar version of Taylor Swift. It's about the person underneath it all. And the story surrounding Ed Sheeran is especially fascinating because Ed has known Taylor for years. He has watched her career evolve, watched her become one of the most recognizable people on the planet, and experienced firsthand what it is like to be close to someone whose entire life can become a public event. Now, material supplied for this story contains a dramatic account involving Taylor, Travis Kelce, and an alleged wedding moment involving Ed. But there is an important distinction we need to make right at the beginning. The supplied interview transcript itself does not establish that this wedding story happened, and the more dramatic wedding account appears separately from the interview material. So rather than presenting every detail as confirmed fact, we're going to separate what Ed actually discussed from what the supplied story claims. And honestly, that makes the story even more interesting. Because underneath all the noise, the interview reveals something much more relatable about Ed himself, and it gives us a fascinating lens through which to think about Taylor's own life. It's the idea that even people living extraordinary lives can still struggle with ordinary questions. Am I working too much? Am I spending enough time with my family? Have I accomplished enough? What happens when the thing you've spent your entire life chasing no longer feels like enough? And perhaps most importantly, how do you remember who you are when the world is constantly telling you who it thinks you should be? That's where this story really begins. Because Ed Sheeran wasn't talking about Taylor as a distant celebrity. He was talking about friendship, music, nostalgia, family, pressure, and the strange experience of growing older while the entire world is watching. And for Swifties, there is something incredibly revealing about hearing one of Taylor's longtime friends speak from that perspective. So if you followed Taylor through every era, every album, every reinvention, and every unexpected chapter, make sure you're subscribed to Taylor Timeline. Because here, we're not just interested in the headline. We're interested in the story underneath it. And this one has a lot underneath it. The old phone that became a time machine, one of the most emotional moments in the supplied interview, doesn't actually begin with Taylor. It begins with an old phone. Ed explained that during a lawsuit, he was required to hand over his old electronic devices. So he gave them up. But there was one phone that had been sitting untouched for years. He explained that he had moved to using a tablet around 2015, at least for email, and had essentially switched the phone off and left it in a box. Imagine that. A phone frozen in time. No updates. No new messages. No new photographs. No modern apps constantly demanding attention. Just an old device containing a version of Ed's life that had stopped moving. Then the lawsuit required him to go back through the phone. And when he finally switched it on again, something extraordinary happened. He described the experience as being like entering a time machine. The first text message was from a friend who had died the year before. The second was an argument with an ex-girlfriend. The third was from a family member he hadn't spoken to in a decade. The fourth was another friend who had passed away. And suddenly, a piece of technology had become an emotional archive. Every message represented a different chapter. Every name belonged to a different version of Ed. Every notification was a reminder of people who had entered his life, changed it, and in some cases were no longer there. That's what nostalgia can do. People often think nostalgia is simply remembering something pleasant. But real nostalgia can be much more complicated. It can make you smile and hurt at the exact same time. And Ed said the experience really spun him out. So he did what a songwriter does. He wrote about it. He opened his notes and wrote about finding the old phone. And eventually, that experience became a song. That's a fascinating glimpse into how Ed Sheeran processes life. Something happens. He feels it. He sits with it. And eventually, he turns it into music. And if you followed Taylor Swift for any length of time, that process should sound familiar. Because Taylor has built an extraordinary career around taking moments that might otherwise disappear and giving them another life through songwriting. A text message. A relationship. A memory. A conversation. A feeling. A goodbye. a moment of embarrassment, a moment of joy, a moment she couldn't stop thinking about. The private becomes the artistic. The temporary becomes permanent. And that's one of the strongest connections between Taylor and Ed. Both understand that memory doesn't have to remain trapped inside your head. Sometimes you can turn it into a song and give it to millions of people. The surprisingly human side of Ed Sheeran later, the conversation moved into music, collaborations, and the people Ed has been fortunate enough to work with. And some of the names he mentioned were enormous. Beyoncé, Andrea Bocelli, Eminem. These are the kinds of collaborations that most musicians would consider career-defining. But what was particularly interesting wasn't simply that Ed had worked with these artists. It was what those memories meant to him personally. Ed admitted that there are times when he becomes self-doubting. Times when he wonders whether his career might be heading downward. Times when he questions where he is going. And that admission is striking. Because from the outside, Ed Sheeran's career looks almost impossibly successful. He has performed for massive audiences. He has released global hits. He has collaborated with some of the biggest names in music. And yet he still experiences those moments when his brain tells him, maybe you're not doing enough. Maybe things aren't going as well as they used to. Maybe the best part is behind you. That is an incredibly human fear. And it is something Taylor Swift has also spoken about in different ways throughout her career. The strange thing about success is that the bigger you become, the more difficult it can be to convince yourself that you've already accomplished enough. There is always another chart, another album, another tour, another expectation, another headline, another comparison, another number. And sometimes, even an extraordinary career can feel ordinary to the person living it. That's why Ed said certain memories act like a reminder. He mentioned performing with Beyoncé. He mentioned bringing Eminem on in Detroit. And he essentially described those experiences as personal evidence. Evidence that he had done some incredible things. Things nobody could take away from him. And that is such an important distinction. The moment isn't necessarily valuable because it produced another headline. It's valuable because years later, Ed can look back and say, I was there. I experienced that. I did that. Nobody can erase it. And for Taylor, that concept feels especially powerful. Because her career has been filled with moments that millions of people watched. But she is still the only person who lived every single one of them. Fans saw the performances. Fans saw the awards. Fans saw the tours. Fans saw the records. But Taylor experienced the long nights, the uncertainty, the decisions, the pressure, the mistakes, the disappointments, and the personal sacrifices behind those moments. And that difference matters. When success isn't the only thing that matters anymore, then the conversation took an even more personal turn. It began talking about adulthood, parenthood, work, and the constant struggle to find balance. He described a dilemma that millions of parents can understand. How much should I work? How much should I be home? And when I'm home, should I be working? It's a question without an easy answer. You want your children to see the value of hard work. You want them to understand ambition, discipline, and determination. But you don't want your ambition to come at the cost of missing the moments that can't be repeated. And that's where the conversation becomes surprisingly relevant to Taylor's life. Because Taylor has spent years living at a level of professional intensity that very few human beings could understand. Her career doesn't operate on a normal schedule. A major album can involve years of writing and recording. A tour can consume enormous stretches of time. A single appearance can generate days of headlines. Even simply walking into a public place can become an event. And yet, as people grow older, their definition of success can change. The things that seemed absolutely essential at 25 may not feel equally important at 35. The goal isn't necessarily to stop achieving. It's to understand what achievement is supposed to give you. And Ed's reflections about family show that he has reached a point where the question isn't simply, how much can I accomplish? It's also, what am I accomplishing all of this for? That is a very different question. And it is one that makes celebrity culture look different from the inside. Because fans often see the finished product. We see the stage, the outfits, the photographs. the applause, the awards. But behind the scenes, celebrities still have to make decisions about dinner, bedtime, family, relationships, exhaustion, and whether they are actually present for the people they love. The post-football question, the conversation also touched on the transition Ed's family had experienced after football retirement. That brought up another fascinating idea. What happens when the schedule that defined your entire life suddenly disappears? For a professional athlete, retirement isn't simply leaving a job. It's losing a structure that has existed for years. Training, games, travel, recovery, competition, a predictable rhythm. And then suddenly, there's a giant question: what's next? That question is especially interesting when we think about someone like Travis Kelce. For years, football has been a central part of his identity. The NFL schedule dictated much of his life. The games, the practices, the travel, the Super Bowls, the media attention, the expectations. And when that chapter eventually changes, the question becomes bigger than football. Who are you when you're no longer defined by the thing you were famous for? That's a question Taylor may understand in her own way. Because Taylor Swift has spent so much of her life being defined by music. What happens if one day she decides she doesn't want to tour the same way? What happens if she wants to slow down? What happens if family becomes more important than another record? What happens if the next chapter is less about proving something and more about simply living? Those are not predictions. They're simply the kinds of questions that become more relevant as people grow older. And perhaps that is why stories about Taylor's personal life attract such enormous attention. Fans aren't only watching a celebrity relationship. They're watching the evolution of a person. The biggest lesson about parenthood, one of the most charming moments in the interview, came when Ed was asked for his best advice to fathers. His answer was surprisingly simple. He recommended being the person who gets up first and makes breakfast. Not because breakfast is some magical parenting formula, but because mornings can create small, intimate moments with children. You prepare the food. You help them get ready. You spend time together before the day begins. And you also give your partner an opportunity to sleep a little longer. It's a small act. But that's exactly why the advice works. Parenthood isn't usually defined by one enormous moment. It's defined by thousands of tiny moments. Making breakfast, reading a book, cleaning up, listening to a child tell a story that makes absolutely no sense, holding them while they fall asleep, answering the same question for the 100th time. And then one day, those ordinary moments become memories. Ed talked about how children are often at their sweetest in the morning. They're rested. They're cuddly. Their voices are softer. They're simply there. And then he said something that may be one of the most beautiful ideas in the entire conversation. We're living in the good old days. Think about that for a second. People usually imagine the good old days as something that happened years ago. A childhood. A special vacation. A particular Christmas. A time before everything became complicated. But what if the good old days aren't behind you? What if you're living them right now? What if the moment you're tempted to rush through is actually the moment you'll wish you could return to 20 years from now? That idea is incredibly powerful. And it applies far beyond parenthood. It applies to every era of Taylor Swift's life. Because Swifties constantly talk about missing previous eras. They miss the Fearless era, the Red era, the 1989 era, Reputation, Lover, Folklore, Evermore, Midnights, the Eras Tour. Every chapter eventually becomes nostalgia. And perhaps that is one of the strangest truths about being a Taylor Swift fan. You don't realize you're living through a Taylor era until it's already becoming history. Why the Taylor and Ed friendship feels different. Taylor and Ed's friendship has always had a different quality from the celebrity relationships that dominate headlines. Part of that comes from longevity. They met during a period when both were still building their careers. They collaborated. They performed together. They supported one another professionally. And they watched each other change. That last part may be the most important. It is one thing to become friends with someone after they've already become famous. It's another thing to know someone while they're still figuring everything out. Before the stadiums. before the enormous productions, before every decision became headline material, before the world knew exactly who they were supposed to be. Those kinds of friendships can become a form of historical memory. Ed doesn't just know Taylor Swift, the superstar. He knows Taylor from another chapter. And Taylor doesn't just know Ed Sheeran, the global singer-songwriter. She knows the person behind the career. That's why his comments about nostalgia feel especially meaningful when viewed through the Taylor lens. Because sometimes the people who knew you before everything exploded can remind you that you're still the same person underneath it. The wedding story. What the supplied material claims. Now we have to address the most dramatic part of the material. The supplied story claims that Ed Sheeran was present at a wedding involving Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce and describes several highly emotional moments. But again, this section is presented separately from the interview transcript, and the transcript itself does not verify those events. So we're treating this as an unverified account, not established fact. According to the supplied story, Ed allegedly described Taylor and Travis's wedding as feeling less like a celebrity spectacle and more like an intimate family gathering. The story claims that Taylor had changed into a lighter dress and was watching Travis interact with children from the Kelce family. It then attributes an emotional comment to Taylor. That is an extraordinary claim. But because the supplied transcript doesn't establish that Ed actually said these words, we shouldn't present them as a confirmed Taylor quote. And this is exactly where celebrity storytelling needs to slow down. Because it's tempting to take the most emotional line and build an entire video around it. But if a quote isn't verified, repeating it as fact doesn't make the story better. It simply makes it less trustworthy. And for a channel like Taylor Timeline, credibility matters. Swifties deserve to know the difference between what Taylor actually said, what a source reported, and what fans are imagining. The supplied story also claims that Travis became emotional during the ceremony and that he wrote personal vows. Again, those details belong to the unverified account. They shouldn't be presented as established history based solely on the material we were given. But there is still an interesting emotional theme underneath the story. The theme is the difference between loving a superstar and loving a person. That's a question that has followed Taylor throughout her career. What does it mean to love someone whose public identity is enormous? Can a relationship survive when millions of people are constantly analyzing it? And can someone like Taylor ever have an ordinary emotional life when almost nothing around her is ordinary? Those questions are real even without relying on an unverified wedding narrative. The idea of being loved beyond the stage, the most compelling part of the wedding story, isn't necessarily the alleged ceremony details. It's the concept behind them. Taylor Swift has spent much of her adult life being perceived through a public lens. Taylor the songwriter. Taylor the performer. Taylor the billionaire. Taylor the record breaker. Taylor the celebrity. Taylor the girlfriend. Taylor the cultural phenomenon. But underneath all those labels is simply Taylor. A daughter. A friend. A songwriter. A person who has experienced loss. A person who has made mistakes. A person who has celebrated victories. A person who has laughed until she couldn't breathe. A person who has cried. A person who has worried about the future. A person who has wanted privacy. A person who has wanted connection. That's the Taylor fans have always been fascinated by. Not because she is ordinary, but because the person underneath the extraordinary career is still human. And Ed's discussion of nostalgia gives us a useful way of understanding that. The old phone didn't care how famous Ed had become. It didn't care how many records he had sold. It didn't care how many awards he had won. It simply contained messages from people who mattered. That is the strange thing about time. Eventually, the numbers fade into the background. What remains are people, moments, memories, songs, and the things that made you feel something. Taylor's career as a collection of memories. Think about Taylor's career this way. Every era is a memory waiting to happen. When a new album arrives, fans immediately begin wondering what it means. What inspired it? What changed? Who is Taylor now? But years later, the questions change. Fans ask, where were you when this came out? What song did you play first? Who did you go to the concert with? What did that era mean to you? That's the power of music. It becomes attached to our own lives. Taylor's songs aren't simply Taylor's memories anymore. They become part of the memories of millions of other people. A song might remind someone of high school. Another might remind someone of a breakup. Another might remind someone of a wedding. Another might remind someone of a parent. Another might bring back an entire summer. And that's why Taylor's career has such unusual emotional longevity. She's not just producing songs. She's creating timestamps. Ed's old phone was a timestamp. Taylor's albums are timestamps too. Different formats. Same basic human idea. This is where I was. This is who I loved. This is what I was going through. This is who I used to be. The pressure of always having to be Taylor Swift, and perhaps that is why the idea of balance becomes so important. Imagine having every decision examined. Imagine millions of people having opinions about your clothes, your relationships, your friendships, your career choices, your body language, your lyrics, your facial expressions, and even who you sit next to. Then imagine trying to maintain an ordinary private life inside all of that. It's almost impossible. Which is why moments of normalcy can become incredibly valuable. A quiet dinner. A family morning. A conversation with an old friend. A night without cameras. A moment when nobody needs anything from you. For someone as famous as Taylor, those things may be worth more than another trophy. And that doesn't mean she has stopped caring about her career. Quite the opposite. It means the career exists within a larger life. That's the lesson hidden inside the conversations about Ed, parenthood, nostalgia, and the future. Success isn't necessarily about choosing between career and family. It's about figuring out what role each one is supposed to play. And that's a question that doesn't have a permanent answer. It changes with every era. The moment fans may connect with most, there is something else in Ed's comments that deserves attention. He admitted that sometimes he needs to remind himself of what he's already accomplished. That might sound strange coming from someone with his career. But perhaps that's exactly why it's important. Because insecurity doesn't always disappear when you become successful. Sometimes it simply becomes harder to admit. You can have the awards and still wonder if you're good enough. You can have the hits and still worry about the next song. You can have millions of fans and still have a bad day. You can accomplish something extraordinary and still wake up wondering what you're doing with your life. That's not failure. That's being human. And if you've ever watched Taylor speak about the pressure surrounding her career, you can understand why this matters. Her accomplishments are almost impossible to comprehend. But accomplishment doesn't automatically silence self-doubt. Sometimes you need someone, or something, to remind you. Look at what you've already done. Look at the people you've helped. Look at the memories you've created. Look at the lives you've touched. Not everything has to be bigger than the thing before it. Sometimes it simply has to mean something. What makes nostalgia so powerful for Swifties understand nostalgia better than most fan communities? Because Taylor's career practically invites it. A lyric can transport someone 10 years into the past. A surprise song can suddenly bring back an entire era. A vintage outfit can send fans searching through old photographs. A single guitar riff can make someone remember where they were when an album first came out. And Taylor herself has often embraced that relationship with time. She revisits old songs, re-records old albums, returns to old stories, reclaims old chapters. And in doing so, she reminds fans that the past doesn't necessarily have to remain untouched. Sometimes you can revisit it with a different perspective. Sometimes you can rewrite the meaning. Sometimes you can finally understand what you couldn't understand at the time. That's why the old phone story is so powerful. Ed wasn't simply looking at old messages. He was meeting old versions of himself. And Taylor's catalog has given millions of fans the opportunity to do exactly the same thing. The Ed Sheeran connection. There is a reason Ed Sheeran's perspective carries weight when talking about Taylor. He isn't someone who appeared in her life for a few weeks. He has been part of the journey. They have shared stages. They have shared music. They have watched each other grow. And that means when Ed talks about his own fears, his family, his memories, and the strange passage of time, fans can naturally wonder what Taylor's version of those questions might look like. What does she want now? What does she value now? What will matter to her 10 years from now? And what parts of her enormous career will she look back on with the same kind of nostalgia that Ed felt when he turned on that forgotten phone? We don't know. And we shouldn't pretend we do. That's part of the beauty of watching someone's life unfold. Some questions are meant to remain unanswered until the person chooses to answer them. The human side of the superstar, maybe that's the real story here. Not the dramatic headline. Not the celebrity fantasy. Not the idea that every private moment has to become public. The real story is that people change. Ed has changed. Taylor has changed. Their lives have changed. Their careers have changed. Their priorities have changed. And the older you get, the more you realize that success isn't a straight line. There are highs. There are lows. There are moments when everything seems to be going perfectly. And there are moments when you question everything. That's true for musicians. It's true for athletes. It's true for parents. And it's true for people sitting at home watching all of it happen. The difference is that celebrities experience those same emotions under an enormous spotlight. Taylor may be one of the most famous people alive. But fame doesn't remove the human questions. It just makes them harder to answer privately. Why this story matters to Taylor fans. So why should Swifties care about an interview that spends so much time talking about Ed Sheeran's own life? Because sometimes the people around Taylor help us understand the world she's part of. Ed's story reminds us that the people in Taylor's circle are not simply celebrities moving from event to event. They are adults, friends, parents, partners, people dealing with aging, memories, uncertainty, and responsibility. And that matters because Taylor's story is no longer only about becoming famous. That chapter happened years ago. Now the story is about what she does with everything she has built. What kind of life does she want? What does she want her relationships to look like? What does she want her future to feel like? And how does she balance being Taylor Swift with simply being Taylor? Those questions are much more interesting than another rumor. Because they are about a person, not just a headline. The biggest thing Ed's story reminds us, if there's one idea to take away from everything Ed said, it's this. You don't always recognize the good old days while you're living them. Sometimes you only realize how special a moment was years later. The child who wants another bedtime story will eventually stop asking. The morning when everyone is crowded around the kitchen table will eventually become a memory. The friend who texts you every day may someday be someone you haven't spoken to in years. The people you assume will always be there may not always be there. And the phone sitting in a box might one day contain an entire life you almost forgot. That's why Ed's story feels so emotional. And that's why it connects so naturally to Taylor's music. Because Taylor has spent her career reminding people to notice the moments before they disappear. Sometimes she does it through a love song. Sometimes through heartbreak. Sometimes through nostalgia. Sometimes through a simple line that suddenly makes an entire room of people think about someone they haven't seen in years. That's the gift. Not simply remembering the past, but recognizing its value while you're still living the present. And then there's the future. The future is always the most interesting part of Taylor's story. Because nobody knows exactly what comes next. There will almost certainly be more music, more performances, more surprises, more records, more chapters. But the question isn't whether Taylor will continue achieving. The question is what those achievements will mean to her as she moves forward. Will the next era be bigger, quieter, more personal, more experimental? Will she continue touring at the same scale? Will she choose different priorities? Will she eventually look back on the era's tour the same way Ed looked back at his biggest collaborations? Will she see it as proof of everything she accomplished? Will she remember individual nights more than the numbers? The answers belong to Taylor. And that's exactly how it should be. The story behind the story. The most fascinating thing about celebrity culture is that the biggest stories are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes the most revealing story is a person admitting they're tired. Sometimes it's a parent talking about breakfast. Sometimes it's an artist looking at an old phone. Sometimes it's a friend remembering another friend. Sometimes it's a musician admitting that even after achieving everything he dreamed about, he still has moments where he wonders if he's doing enough. And sometimes the most important thing is realizing that the people we watch from a distance are still living lives that are full of uncertainty. That's why Ed Sheeran's comments are worth listening to. Not because they reveal every secret about Taylor Swift. They don't. And not because every dramatic claim surrounding the supplied story should automatically be believed. It shouldn't. But because they remind us of something much more valuable. Taylor's world is made up of real people. People who have known her before the headlines. People who have grown alongside her. People who remember different versions of her. People who have their own families, their own struggles, their own memories, and their own fears. And behind every enormous Taylor Swift headline is still a human story. The final thought may be one day, years from now, Taylor will look back at this period of her life the way Ed looked at that old phone. She'll remember the songs, the people, the concerts, the laughter, the pressure, the impossible nights, the moments that seemed ordinary at the time but became unforgettable later. And perhaps she'll realize that the most important memories weren't always the biggest ones. Maybe it was a quiet morning, a conversation with an old friend, a family gathering, a song played on an acoustic guitar, a joke that made everyone laugh, a night when nobody was watching. Those are the moments that eventually become the good old days. And that's the part of Taylor's story that can sometimes get lost beneath the fame. She's not just building a career. She's building a life. And like everyone else, she only gets to live each moment once. The difference is that millions of people are watching. But some moments don't belong to the audience. Some memories belong only to the people who were there. And maybe that's exactly how it should be. As for the dramatic wedding account included in the supplied material, we'll keep the distinction clear. Until such claims are independently verified, they remain an unconfirmed story rather than established Taylor Swift history. Because loving Taylor's story also means respecting the truth of it. And perhaps that is the most fitting lesson from Ed Sheeran's old phone. Time keeps moving. People change. Memories become precious. And eventually, the things we thought would last forever become the stories we tell about who we used to be. Taylor Swift has spent her entire career turning those stories into songs. And whatever comes next, one thing is certain: there will be another chapter. Another era. Another memory. Another moment that Swifties will someday look back on and say, "We were there. This was one of the good old days." If you want to keep following every chapter of Taylor's journey, the music, the relationships, the major milestones, the unexpected moments, and the stories behind the headlines, stay with Taylor Timeline. Because Taylor's story isn't finished. Not even close. And the next chapter may be the one nobody sees coming.